Today is a historically negative day for India. Not because of politics, not because of ideology, not because of any economic rumor, but because the Indian rupee has officially crossed 90 rupees per US dollar. In many markets, it has fallen even further. Headlines across the world, from Washington to London to Singapore, are reporting the same thing. 1 USD now costs over 90 Indian rupees. Indian rupee hits record low. And here's the interesting part for our US viewers. A year ago, when the rupee was at 84, I told you, based on data, not predictions, that it would fall to 90. Many people dismissed it as negativity. Some called it political bias. But data doesn't care about politics. Economics doesn't care about ideology. And now here we are, 90 rupees per dollar, a historic low. But why did this happen? Why did the rupee fall so sharply? And what does this mean for American consumers, US companies, Indian exporters, Indian families, and global markets? This video will break that down with complete clarity. No politics, no sugarcoating, just facts. Before we talk about India, let's talk about what's happening in the United States. The US dollar has been on a strengthening cycle due to three major reasons. 1. High Fed interest rates. The Federal Reserve has kept interest rates high. Whenever US interest rates rise, two things happen. Investors pull money out of emerging markets. They put that money back into US Treasuries. That increases the demand for the USD. 2. Geopolitical uncertainty, global conflicts, Red Sea tensions, Russia-Ukraine, Taiwan-China, all push investors toward the dollar, which is considered a safe asset. When fear rises, the dollar rises. 3 US tech dominance companies like Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, Meta have pulled in trillions in global investment. Investors convert their local currencies into dollars to buy US tech stocks. So yes, part of the rupee's fall is because the dollar is extremely strong. But this time, something else happened. Something bigger, something directly connected to US trade policy. This is the side of the story US media barely covered. Under the Trump administration, the US imposed massive tariffs on Indian goods. Not small tariffs, not symbolic tariffs, but 50% tariffs, the highest imposed on any country in the world. Let me repeat that for our US audience. India today faces the highest US tariffs of any nation, 50%. India didn't retaliate. India didn't impose reciprocal tariffs. Why? Because New Delhi knows the US is still the most powerful economy in the world. India is strong, but not yet strong enough to go into a tariff war with Washington. What happened next? Indian exports to the US collapsed by 28%. Plus, that is not a small dip. That is a historic fall. Imagine a company losing 28% of its biggest customer. That company will bleed. That's what happened to Indian exporters. And when a country exports less, its currency weakens. This is economics 101. When fewer dollars flow into India, the rupee loses support. When the rupee loses support, it falls. The US tariff shock forced Indian exporters to look for new markets: Africa, Japan, Europe, Southeast Asia. But here's the problem. When you enter a new market, you need a competitive advantage, something that makes your product cheaper than the local competitor. And guess what gives you that advantage? A weak currency. So India's central bank, the RBI, didn't aggressively defend the rupee this time. Instead, they allowed exporters to get a short-term boost by letting the rupee fall, making Indian goods cheaper abroad, helping companies enter new markets quickly. From a strategic point of view, this makes sense. From a domestic consumer point of view, it hurts. Because whenever a currency falls, ordinary citizens pay the price. This part is specifically for the US audience. When the Indian rupee drops, 1. American companies benefit US companies operating in India, from Walmart to Amazon to Apple, get cheaper labor, cheaper operations, and cheaper sourcing. 2. American consumers may see cheaper Indian goods. If tariffs weren't in place, US consumers would benefit massively from cheaper Indian imports. But because of the tariffs, US consumers are not getting that advantage. 3. US inflation remains higher than necessary. Cheap imports normally reduce inflation, but tariffs prevented that from happening. This is why American economists, from Harvard to Stanford, have repeatedly said that Trump-era tariffs hurt American families more than foreign exporters. Now let's talk about India. For the average Indian citizen, 1. Foreign travel becomes more expensive. Everything. Flights, Food, hotels, becomes costlier when the rupee falls. 2. Fuel prices rise. India imports over 80% of its oil. When the rupee weakens, fuel prices rise. When fuel rises, everything else rises. 3. Imports become expensive. iPhones, laptops, medical equipment, cars, foreign education, online services all become more expensive. 4. Savings lose value. Historically, the rupee has depreciated 3.5% to 5% every year for decades. But this year, it fell nearly 10%, double the usual rate. That means your salary went up 5%, your rupee lost 10%. Net result, you are poorer in real terms. This is why the middle class feels the pressure. Last time the rupee fell to 87 rupees, India's finance ministry said the rupee isn't weak, the dollar is strong. That statement was partially true because at the time, the rupee hadn't fallen against other currencies. But today, the rupee has weakened against the euro, the yen, the pound, the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, and multiple Asian currencies. This is a broad-based fall, not a USD-specific fall, and that is why everyone is concerned. Usually, India's central bank, RBI, steps in to defend the currency. But this time, RBI didn't buy as much rupee, RBI didn't aggressively stabilize the market. Why? Because India needs its exporters to survive the tariff shock. A slightly weaker rupee helps them. This is a strategic decision, not a failure, but it still hurts ordinary citizens in the short term. This entire situation raises a critical question for both countries. If the US considers India a strategic partner, why impose the highest tariffs on India? The G2 idea, dead. The Quad Summit, not happening. The Indo-Pacific strategy, frozen. Under Trump, the US is acting with a purely America-first mindset, and India is absorbing the shock, quietly, to avoid escalation. But how long will this continue? At some point, New Delhi will have to take a tough decision. In US media, whenever tariffs are discussed, the coverage almost always focuses on China. But while the China-US trade war was dominating headlines, another tariff war was quietly unfolding against India. Here's the surprising truth that almost no major American outlet explained. India today faces the highest US tariffs of any country, up to 50%, higher than China, Mexico, Vietnam, Brazil, South Korea, or any other major exporter. Why would Washington impose such steep tariffs on a country it calls a strategic ally? Reason number one, the US wants supply chain control. Washington wants to reduce dependence on China, but replacing Chinese supply chains means creating a new system, one where the US controls the technology, data, and manufacturing standards. India, meanwhile, is building its own independent system. That creates friction. Reason number two, India's manufacturing rise threatens US sectors. Over the last 10 years, India has become competitive in pharmaceuticals, textiles, IT services, electronics, renewable energy components, auto parts. American manufacturers quietly lobbied to slow down India's rise. Tariffs do exactly that. Reason number three, domestic US politics. During election cycles, tariffs are popular messaging tools. They make leaders look tough, decisive, protective of American jobs. India became collateral damage in this political game. Reason number four, trade deficit. Concerns the US has a significant trade deficit with India. Tariffs were meant to reduce that, but they backfired. When tariffs hit, this happened. Indian exports to the US dropped by over 28%. When 1/4 of your exports to your biggest customer vanish, your currency loses support. Because a currency strengthens when dollars come in, investments rise, exports grow. India lost all three simultaneously. The shock was massive. India is the world's 5th largest economy, but still developing. Removing billions of dollars in export revenue forced Indian companies to look elsewhere. And this is where the rupee enters the story.